If one wanted to date when the women's movement began, I think one would start earlier than the mid-1960s. I think one might start with the year 1957. The birth control pill wouldn't come out till 1960, but birth rates began to decline in 1957. The proportion of women going to college rose very sharply in the 5 years after 1957. A sharply increasing number of young women began to live on their own, away from parental control. And there was a very sharp increase in married women entering the workforce. So I would argue that it's in this 5-year span from about 1957 to 1962 that you begin to see the marked discrepancy between the image of womanhood, the feminine mystique, as Betty Friedan would call it, and the reality of women's lives, which are now fundamentally different. Women alone, pursuing an education and pursuing a career. They were bound on a collision course. The collision occurs with the publication of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique in 1963. In her book, Betty Friedan argued that the mass media and educators and social scientists and politicians were all conspiring to create an image of womanhood that all women were supposed to find fulfilling, and that was an image of womanhood as mother and wife. Women were supposed to pity neurotic women who might become scientists or poets. Many women read Betty Friedan's book and could understand the message that society was telling them that they should be happy when they weren't. Betty Friedan called this the problem with no name, but pretty soon it had a name, and that name was sexism. To most Americans, the women's movement seemed to blossom out of nothing. There seemed to be no roots, but in fact, what we know is that there was a great concern about women's discontent just as the 1960s were beginning. Magazines like Newsweek and Time did cover stories about women's discontent. Newspapers like the New York Times ran editorials about why women were unhappy. One magazine, Red Book, asked readers, "Why are young mothers discontented?" It received 40,000 replies. Clearly, underneath the surface, there was a great deal of unhappiness with the way women's roles were structured and the kind of aspirations that women were allowed. Increasingly, women already had come to believe that marrying at a very young age and having a house full of children was not the acme of fulfillment. It's hard, I think, for most Americans to know how really different women's lives were in the 1950s were from the way they would be since. The greatest number of American women married at the age of 17. Half of all American women were married by the age of 20. The typical woman had 3, 4, or 5 children during the 1950s. Her mother had had fewer children. Increasingly, as the decade wore on, women were feeling that this was just not a very fulfilling way of life. Half of all American women who went to college during the 1950s dropped out. It was said as a joke that there should be a new degree, the PhD, the putting husband through, because many women who dropped out of college were dropping out to finance their husbands' educations. And so when Betty Friedan comes out with the book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, it becomes a huge success, not simply because it's wonderfully written and very evocative, but because there's already an audience that's prepared for its message. A group of women who feel that their lives are not as fulfilling as they should be, who feel trapped, who feel that they need new options, new opportunities. And what Betty Friedan does is she spells out precisely what's wrong with women's lives. And that is the idea that women should achieve total fulfillment as wives and mothers, and not through fulfilling careers. The key to understanding what happened to the family during the 1960s, I think, is a fundamental shift in values. During the 1950s, the value system tended to emphasize adjustment, tended to emphasize conformity. But by the mid-1960s, a new value system, stressing growth, fulfillment, and self-realization, had begun to appear. And this new set of values told people that they shouldn't simply accept the way they were living, but should be willing to challenge it. They should try to grow. They should try to find more fulfilling relationships. And the result, I think, was a fundamental revolution in American family life. Birth rates fell by half. Divorce rates doubled. The number of couples cohabitating outside of marriage quadrupled. In other words, in the span of just 10 years, America's families went through more changes than they had gone through in the previous 200 years. Back in 1968, Nelson Rockefeller's bid for the presidency was destroyed for one simple fact: he was divorced. 2 decades later, it was possible for a man to become president who was divorced, and everyone knew it. A fundamental shift in values took place in a very short period of time. What were some of those changes in values? One of the most obvious was that marriages should be based on love and fulfillment. And if they're not producing love and fulfillment, they should and could end in divorce. And divorce would not be stigmatized the way it had been in the past. Other values that the culture was embracing included self-realization, self-actualization, fulfillment. These are the kind of values that Americans are beginning to embrace in the late 60s and early 1970s. In 1963, the United States passed the first act in its history that provided protection for equal pay for women workers, the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Then in 1964, the Civil Rights Act barred discrimination against women in employment and promotion. And so already you begin to see a new sensitivity, an unprecedented sensitivity to issues of gender in American society. But then something happened. Women discovered that the federal government was not enforcing its new laws. And it was this failure to enforce laws on the books that led Betty Friedan and many other women to form the National Organization for Women, to try to pressure Congress and the President to enforce laws that had already been enacted. And on college campuses throughout the country, independent women's movements were emerging. But the issue that brought the women's movement to public attention was something quite different. It was the 1968 Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, where a group of women protested the Miss America pageant and crowned a sheep Miss America. It was this incident, I think more than any other, that attracted enormous public attention from newspapers, from the television news, from major magazines. And suddenly the women's movement was on everybody's lips. Just to give you an example, 1/3 of all American corporations had separate pay scales for women workers. Prior to federal enforcement of anti-discrimination procedures, discrimination against women was rampant, and feminism addressed real needs. But the other thing that people sometimes forget is that feminism quickly produced a backlash among women, certain kind of women, women who define their identity in terms of being wives and mothers. And so, in 1972, Congress quickly ratified an Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It was then sent to the states, which would then have to finish the ratification process. Many states quickly ratified the amendment, and then, largely because of the efforts of one woman, Phyllis Schlafly, the ratification drive was stalled. And even though Congress later would extend the period for ratification, the Equal Rights Amendment was defeated. And it was defeated not because of male resistance. Most opinion polls showed that men didn't care much one way or the other, but because one group of women felt very threatened by what the Equal Rights Amendment symbolized. The women's movement had radical consequences for American family life. It convinced most American women that they could combine a career and family. In the past, most Americans had believed that if you had a career, you simply couldn't marry. The women's movement said that that was wrong. It also convinced most American women that family life should involve sharing, that they should not be single-handedly responsible for child care, for homework, and everything else around the house, that this had to be split among men and women. What opinion polls have demonstrated is that whether women consider themselves feminists or not, they agree today that women should be free to have a career and that men and women must share household responsibilities. The women's movement had one unanticipated consequence, and that was to produce a backlash among many women who felt threatened by the changes that the women's movement was promoting. Many women who viewed their identity as full-time wives and house and mothers felt very threatened by the women's movement. Back in the 1950s and early 1960s, the most popular show on daytime television was Queen for a Day. And on that show, people stood and applauded when a woman announced that her career was that of homemaker. These women who continued to define their identity as wives and mothers felt very threatened. They were afraid that their lifestyle was being stigmatized, that their whole way of life was being trivialized and laughed at, that women should have more serious occupations outside the home rather than a serious occupation within the home. These women felt very threatened by the women's movement, and they would develop their own movement to protest against it, a movement that would soon take up the name the pro-family movement. The family became a battleground in American society. Many social conservatives believed that the changes that were taking place in American families were disastrous. They were concerned that divorce, single parenting, and working mothers was leading to a disaster for American society, and they began to develop a whole political agenda designed to stop or even reverse those changes. They called for an end to eroticism on television. They called for an end to making contraceptives available to adolescents. They called for restrictions on abortion. And at the same time, many other Americans who believed these changes were basically good, were basically promotive of human happiness, battled them. So for a decade, the bitterest political conflicts in American society turned on the institution of the family. Would we promote a new, more flexible, if less stable family unit? Or would we try to turn back the hands of time and reinstitute as best we could the more rigid and more stable family of the 1950s? Many Americans today are concerned that the kind of changes that occurred in American family life during the 1960s have exacted their greatest toll on children. The rising divorce rate, the influx of women into the workforce have all meant that children are growing up in a less stable environment than their parents did. Furthermore, they're growing up in a more permissive environment, saturated with sex, drugs, and crime. And so for many Americans, there's a concern that it's becoming increasingly difficult to grow up as a well-adjusted adult, that you're growing up in a very precarious environment where traditional social supports are breaking down. And these are changes that people haven't grasped out of nowhere. There are tangible signs that the well-being of children may in fact be declining. The increasing visibility of eating disorders among young women, a tripling in rates of teenage suicide, declining test scores on college aptitude tests, rising crime among young people. To many Americans, both of the left and the right, there's a fear that the kind of changes that have taken place in American family life may have had catastrophic consequences for American children.